They told him the device was forbidden. The quick-release box had been officially rejected 3 years earlier, after a test dummy named Oscar slipped free from his harness at 1,200 feet and plummeted to the ground in front of assembled dignitaries at Fort Benning, Georgia. The report, filed on August 11, 1941, had been clear. No available type quick-release box is considered satisfactory. Production was stopped. The snap hook closure system was adopted instead. Every paratrooper in the European theatre of operations jumped with snap hooks, not quick-release boxes. But Staff Sergeant James Morrison wasn't thinking about regulations on the morning of September 10, 1944. He was thinking about the bodies. 37 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division had drowned in the flooded fields behind Utah Beach on the night of June 6. They had landed in water, weighted down with 70 pounds of equipment, tangled in their harness straps. The standard T5 parachute harness required a man to unbuckle 4 separate snap hooks under his arms and between his legs, then release the chest straps. In daylight, on dry ground, with no enemy fire, this took 15 to 20 seconds. In darkness, in chest-deep water, with a deployed canopy dragging you face down through flooded pasture, it was a death sentence. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Morrison worked in the parachute rigging shed at an airfield in England. He had been a rigger since 1942, one of the specialists responsible for packing, inspecting, and maintaining the parachutes that kept paratroopers alive. He understood silk and nylon the way a mechanic understands engines. He could pack a 28-foot canopy into a backpack tray in 11 minutes, folding each panel according to the technical manual. Specifications: routing the suspension lines through the deployment bag, securing everything with brake cord that would snap cleanly when the static line pulled. Now he stood at his work table with a T5 harness laid out before him and a hacksaw in his hand. The orders had come down from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force 2 weeks earlier. All T5 parachute harnesses were to be retrofitted with quick-release boxes. The same quick-release boxes that had been banned in 1941. The same design that military planners had declared unsatisfactory. The same mechanism that had failed during the test that ended the original program. But SHAEF wasn't asking. The drownings in Normandy had forced a reckoning. General Dwight Eisenhower himself had reviewed the after-action reports. The airborne commanders had submitted their casualty analyses. The numbers were undeniable. Paratroopers were dying not from enemy fire but from their own equipment, trapped in their harnesses, in water that barely came up to their chests. The modification order specified exactly how the work was to be done. Morrison was to cut off both chest straps from the existing harness. He was to replace them with new white webbing fitted with release lugs that connected to a single-point quick-release box mounted on the chest. He was to manufacture extensions that clipped onto the existing leg straps, providing the necessary extra length for the new configuration. The entire harness would now release with a single strike to a metal box, allowing a paratrooper to drop free from the parachute in less than 2 seconds. The controversial device was coming back, not because the engineering had improved, not because new testing had validated the design, but because men had drowned and something had to change, and this was the only solution available in time for the next operation. The T5 parachute had seemed adequate when it was standardized in June 1941. Right field. Engineers had designed it as an improvement over the T4, the first American combat parachute. The T5 featured a 28-foot diameter canopy made of silk, later nylon, with 30 suspension lines connecting to a cotton webbing harness. The static line deployment system was simple and reliable. When a paratrooper jumped from a C-47 transport aircraft, a 15-foot static line attached to a cable inside the plane would pull the deployment bag from the backpack. The canopy and suspension lines deployed simultaneously, a design feature that would prove significant in ways the engineers hadn't anticipated. The harness itself was constructed from 5,000-pound test webbing, olive drab in color, with forged steel hardware connecting the various straps. A paratrooper stepped into the leg straps, pulled the harness up over his shoulders, and secured it using 4 snap hook closures. 2 hooks fastened under the arms, connecting the chest straps to the back straps. 2 more, hooks fastened between the legs, connecting the leg straps to the saddle. The system was considered secure, reliable, and proven through thousands of training jumps. What the system was not designed for was rapid escape. The snap hooks required deliberate action to release. Each hook had a spring-loaded gate that had to be lifted with the thumb while simultaneously pulling the webbing free. This was intentional. Designers wanted to prevent accidental disconnection during the violent opening shock when the parachute deployed. A paratrooper exiting a C-47 at 120 miles per hour experienced significant forces when his parachute opened 3 to 4 seconds after exit. The harness had to stay connected through that shock, through the oscillating descent, through any collision with other parachutists or with trees during landing. But the designers at Wright Field in Ohio had not anticipated the Normandy drop zones. They had not planned for the deliberate flooding of Cotentin Peninsula by German defenders, who had opened the locks on the Douve and Murderet rivers weeks before the invasion. They had not accounted for paratroopers scattered across 10 miles of French countryside by bad navigation and German anti-aircraft fire, landing blind in the darkness of early June 6th, dropping into water they couldn't see until impact. Private Robert Murphy of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment had landed in one of these flooded fields. The water was perhaps 4 feet deep, not deep enough to swim, not shallow enough to stand comfortably with 70 pounds of equipment. His parachute canopy had collapsed behind him, settling on the water's surface. Wind caught the silk, dragging him backward. He went under, surfaced, went under again. His hands found the first snap hook, pulled it free, found the second. The webbing was soaked, the metal slippery. The canopy kept pulling. He managed to release the third hook. The fourth one jammed. His fingers, cold and clumsy in the darkness, couldn't get the gate to lift. He went under again. A private from the 82nd Airborne found Murphy's body 3 days later, still in the harness, the fourth snap hook still connected. There were 36 others. Some had gotten 1 or 2 hooks released before drowning. Some had released none. A few had gotten all 4 unhooked, but had run out of time, getting free of the leg straps and chest straps before the waterlogged canopy pulled them under. The after-action reports were clinical in their language, but devastating in their implications. Cause of death: drowning. Contributing factor: inability to release parachute harness in sufficient time. Recommendation: investigate rapid release mechanisms for combat parachute harnesses. The problem was that rapid release mechanisms had already been investigated and rejected. The history went back to the first live jump testing of the T-5 parachute in the spring of 1941. Wright Field had developed 3 prototype versions for evaluation at Fort Benning. The first prototype used snap hook closures. The second featured the Irving quick-release box. The third used a less complicated quick-release device designed by the Material Division. The Irving quick-release box was an elegant piece of engineering. A single metal housing mounted on the chest contained 4 cable connectors. The leg straps and chest straps all connected to this central box through steel cables and release lugs. A paratrooper could strike the circular release button in the center of the box with the heel of his hand, and all 4 connection points would release simultaneously. The entire harness would fall away. What took 15 seconds with snap hooks could be accomplished in under 2 seconds with the quick-release box. The testing went well initially. 50 quick-release parachutes were delivered to Fort Benning on July 25, 1941. Paratroopers made training jumps. The devices functioned as designed. The rapid escape capability was exactly what airborne commanders wanted. By September 3rd, the Provisional Parachute Group had 330 quick-release T-5 seconds on hand. A contract with Irving Parachute Company promised production of 100 to 150 parachutes weekly. Then came August 11th, 1941, at 8:18 in the evening. A test drop using a weighted dummy to simulate a paratrooper. The dummy was named Oscar, constructed of canvas, heavy rope, and lead-shot bag weights to replicate the mass and center of gravity of a soldier with combat equipment. Oscar had successfully completed hundreds of test drops with various parachute designs. On this particular test, Oscar was fitted with one of the new T5 quick-release parachutes. The test aircraft climbed to 1,200 feet above the Fort Benning drop zone. A crowd of dignitaries and military observers had gathered to watch the demonstration. The Army was preparing to expand its airborne forces. Contracts were being finalized, production schedules were being established. Everything depended on the parachute system being proven reliable. Oscar was pushed from the aircraft door. The static line deployed the parachute. The canopy opened normally. Then, as observers watched from the ground, the harness released. Oscar slipped free from the straps. The parachute continued to descend, empty, while Oscar plummeted separately, impacting the ground seconds later in a cloud of dust in front of the assembled crowd. The investigation could not determine with certainty whether the failure was caused by improper handling during test preparation or by a flaw in the quick-release box itself. But the doubt was sufficient. On August 27th, a conference of airborne officers and right field engineers concluded that no available type quick-release box is considered satisfactory. Production was ordered stopped on September 5th. Parachute Company submitted a claim for $6,135.41 to cover the costs of the cancelled contract. The snap hook closure system became standard. Every T4 and T5 parachute harness manufactured from September 1941 through August 1944 used snap hooks. Over 100,000 parachutes. Every training jump in the United States, every combat jump in North Africa, Sicily, Italy and Normandy. The 82nd Airborne Division, the 101st Airborne Division, the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion. All of them jumped with snap hooks because a test dummy had fallen from the sky 3 years earlier. Now, in September 1944, the quick-release box was coming back. Schaeff had made the decision. The risk of the device failing was acceptable compared to the certainty of more drownings. Morrison picked up his hacksaw and began cutting through the chest straps of the T5 harness on his work table. The modification work began in earnest during the second week of September 1944. Every parachute rigging shed in England received the same orders. Every rigger received the same technical specifications. The work was to be completed on a crash basis, meaning around the clock, with all available personnel reassigned to the modification program. Morrison's rigging shed at the airfield near Membury operated 3 shifts. The day shift ran from 0600 to 1400 hours. The evening shift from 1400 to 2200. The night shift from 2200 to 0600. Each shift had 12 riggers, men who had been packing parachutes since the airborne divisions deployed to England in 1943. They knew the work. They understood the stakes. The technical specifications for the modification were detailed, but allowed for variation in execution. This would later become significant. Each rigger interpreted the instructions slightly differently. Some cut the chest straps flush with the existing stitching. Others left a half-inch stub. Some used white Type 8 webbing for all the replacement straps. Others mixed white and olive drab depending on what materials were available in the supply room. The leg strap extensions could be attached 2 different ways. Simple clip-on extensions were faster to manufacture but less secure. Entirely new leg straps spliced into the harness saddle were more time-consuming but provided better integration. The quick-release boxes themselves came from 2 sources. Some were cannibalized from Canadian parachute harnesses, which had continued using quick-release systems throughout the war. These boxes had round release buttons. Others were newly manufactured to updated specifications, featuring squared-off release buttons and slightly different internal mechanisms. A square of brown horsehair felt was mounted underneath each box to cushion it against the paratrooper's chest during the opening shock. Morrison worked methodically. He would lay a T5 harness flat on his work table, olive drab webbing forming a complex pattern of straps and hardware. He would identify the 2 chest straps that connected the shoulder webbing to the back straps. Using his hacksaw, he would cut through both chest straps just behind where they connected to the snap hook hardware. The canvas chest guard, a small square of fabric meant to prevent the metal hardware from digging into the paratrooper's chest, would be roughly hacked off. The cut edges of the webbing would be temporarily sealed with a lighter flame to prevent fraying. Then came the assembly of the new components. White Type 8 webbing, 5,000 pounds test strength, would be measured and cut to the correct length. One end of each strap would be fitted with a release lug, a metal connector designed to interface with the quick release box. The lugs were sewn in place using 5-cord cotton thread in what riggers called the rigger style, meaning functional rather than beautiful. The stitching was rough, uneven, but strong. These modifications were being made in field conditions with time constraints. Appearance was irrelevant. The quick release box would be mounted on the white chest straps, positioned to sit centered on the Paratrooper's sternum. The 4 release lugs, 2 from the chest straps and 2 from the leg strap extensions, would all connect to the box. A V-ring used for attaching equipment bags would be sewn onto the right shoulder area, directly onto the olive drab webbing or sometimes onto a small square of white webbing first. Each completed modification took approximately 2 hours. Morrison could complete 4 harnesses per 8-hour shift. Across all 3 shifts, his rigging shed modified approximately 36 harnesses per day. The target was 1,500 modified harnesses to equip the 101st Airborne Division for the upcoming operation. Time required, approximately 42 days. Time available, less than a week. The operation was called Market Garden. The largest airborne operation in history. 3 Allied airborne divisions would drop into the Netherlands to secure a corridor of bridges stretching from the Belgian border to the Rhine River at Arnhem. The British 1st Airborne Division would take Arnhem. The American 82nd Airborne would take Nijmegen. The American 101st Airborne would take Eindhoven and the bridges at Zonn, Best, and Vehel. British armoured divisions would drive up the corridor, crossing each bridge in sequence, reaching the Rhine within 48 hours. The jump was scheduled for September 17th. On September 10th, exactly 1 week before the operation, the modified T-5 parachutes were still being assembled in rigging sheds across England. The 101st Airborne Division had priority for the modified harnesses because they had suffered the heaviest casualties from drowning in Normandy. The 82nd Airborne would jump with standard T-5 harnesses using snap hook closures. There simply wasn't time to modify enough parachutes for both divisions. Private First Class Donald Burgett of Company A, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, received his modified parachute on September 15th during final equipment inspection at the marshalling area. He noticed immediately that something was different. The white webbing straps stood out against his olive drab uniform. The metal box on his chest was unfamiliar. A lieutenant explained the quick release mechanism. 1 strike to the button with the heel of your hand. All 4 connection points release simultaneously. The entire harness falls away. Don't activate it in the air. Don't activate it during the opening shock. Wait until you're on the ground with the canopy collapsed. Then, if you need to move quickly, strike the button. The lieutenant didn't explain the history. He didn't mention that this device had been banned 3 years earlier. He didn't discuss the test dummy that had fallen from the sky at Fort Benning. He simply demonstrated the release mechanism, verified that each paratrooper understood how it functioned, and moved on to the next man in line. Burgett examined the quick release box. The button was round, approximately 2 inches in diameter, mounted flush in the center of a rectangular metal housing. The housing was perhaps 4 inches wide and 5 inches tall, constructed of cadmium-plated steel. 4 cable attachment points, 1 at each corner, connected to the release lugs on the chest straps and leg straps. The mechanism felt solid under his fingers. He practiced striking the button. A crisp mechanical click. The 4 release lugs popped free. The harness fell open. He reconnected everything and practiced again. Click. Release. The motion became automatic. On the morning of September 17th, Burgett stood in the door of a C-47 transport aircraft over the Netherlands. Below, the Dutch countryside spread out in a patchwork of fields and villages. Smoke rose from several locations where German anti-aircraft batteries had engaged the transport formations. The jump altitude was 600 feet, standard for combat operations, lower than training jumps, which were typically conducted at 800 to 1,000 feet, but necessary to reduce the time paratroopers spent vulnerable in the air. The green light came on. The jumpmaster shouted, "Go!" Birgit shuffled forward and jumped. The propeller blast caught him, spinning him to the right. 3 seconds later, the static line pulled his deployment bag free. The canopy deployed with the characteristic opening shock, jerking him upright in the harness. The white chest straps took the load. The quick release box pressed against his sternum. Everything held. The descent took approximately 30 seconds. Birgit could see other strapped paratroopers filling the sky around him, hundreds of canopies in camouflage and white silk. He could see the landing zone below, a cleared field north of Zon, no water, solid ground. He prepared for landing, knees bent, feet together, ready to execute a parachute landing fall. Impact. Birgit hit the ground and rolled, the technique absorbing the shock across his shoulder, back, and hip. The canopy collapsed beside him. No wind to drag the silk. He rolled to his knees, hand already reaching for the quick release button. One strike. Click. The harness fell away completely. He was free of the parachute in less than 3 seconds from touchdown. Around him, hundreds of other paratroopers from the 506th were executing the same rapid escape. White canopies dotted the field. Men were scrambling free of their harnesses, grabbing their weapons, forming into squads. The quick-release boxes worked exactly as designed. No jammed snap hooks, no fumbling with multiple connection points. Single strike. Immediate release. For the 101st Airborne Division on September 17th, the modified parachutes functioned without significant problems. The landing zones near Zon were dry. The jump altitude of 600 feet was sufficient for reliable canopy deployment. The opening shock, while violent, was within the design parameters of the quick-release mechanism. None of the feared accidental releases occurred during deployment or descent. The device that had been banned in 1941 was working in combat conditions in 1944, but the story that emerged in the weeks following Market Garden was more complex than simple success. Reports began filtering back through medical channels, through unit after-action reviews, through informal conversations between paratroopers. The quick-release boxes had indeed allowed rapid escape from harnesses, but they had also introduced new failure modes that the original snap hook system had not exhibited. Several paratroopers reported that the opening shock had caused the quick release button to activate on its own. The violent deceleration when the canopy deployed, combined with equipment shifting on the chest, had apparently struck the release button with sufficient force to trigger the mechanism. These men had found themselves falling free from their harnesses at 400 feet, with no parachute. The reports were initially dismissed as user error, paratroopers accidentally striking their own release buttons during the confusion of exit and deployment. But the descriptions were too consistent. Multiple independent reports of the same failure mode from different units. The investigation traced the problem to variations in how individual riggers had assembled the modifications. Some quick-release boxes had been mounted too high on the chest, positioning the button where it could be struck by the reserve parachute pack during opening shock. Others had been mounted without sufficient padding underneath, allowing the metal housing to dig into the chest and causing the paratrooper's own body to trigger the release through compression. The horsehair felt pads that were supposed to cushion the boxes had not been installed on all modifications due to material shortages and time constraints. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. First Lieutenant Robert Brewer of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment survived one of these failures. He jumped from 550 feet over the Dutch countryside. His parachute deployed normally. The opening shock was severe, as always. He felt the quick release box compress against his chest. Then he felt the harness go slack, the distinctive click of the release mechanism. He looked down. The chest straps had separated from the release lugs. The leg straps were still connected but wouldn't support his weight alone. He was falling, still attached to the parachute by suspension lines, but no longer secured in the harness. Brewer's hands found the reserve parachute ripcord mounted on his chest pack. He pulled. The reserve deployed, a 24-foot canopy that opened below his malfunctioning main parachute. The two canopies entangled briefly, then separated, providing enough drag to slow his descent. He hit the ground hard, but survived with a fractured ankle and severe bruising. His report was filed on September 20th, 3 days after the jump. The failures continued through the 17 days of Market Garden. Not in overwhelming numbers, the majority of quick-release modifications functioned as intended, but enough paratroopers experienced inadvertent releases during opening shock that the pattern became undeniable. The device that was supposed to save lives by enabling rapid escape after landing was instead releasing men from their harnesses while they were still hundreds of feet in the air. Technical analysis conducted after the operation identified 3 primary failure mechanisms. First, the quick-release boxes cannibalized from Canadian parachute harnesses used a different internal spring tension than the newly manufactured American versions. The Canadian boxes required less force to activate, making them more susceptible to accidental release from opening shock or equipment impact. Second, the rushed field modifications had resulted in inconsistent positioning of the release boxes on different harnesses. Boxes mounted too high placed the release button directly in line with the reserve parachute pack, which could shift during opening shock and strike the button. Third, insufficient padding under some boxes allowed the mechanism to compress against the paratrooper's chest during deceleration, with the paratrooper's own sternum effectively triggering the release. By October 1st, 1944, the Army's Quartermaster Corps had compiled casualty data from Market Garden. 14 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division were confirmed to have fallen to their deaths due to premature harness release. 7 others had deployed reserve parachutes after their main harness released, surviving with injuries ranging from fractured bones to severe internal trauma. 21 casualties directly attributable to the quick-release modification, compared to the 37 drownings in Normandy that had prompted the modification in the first place. The numbers presented military planners with an impossible calculation. The quick-release boxes prevented drowning deaths in water landings, but caused falling deaths in dry landings. Which risk was acceptable? Which failure mode should the airborne forces prepare for? The answer depended on terrain, on drop zone selection, on factors that couldn't be predicted with certainty before each operation. Staff Sergeant Morrison received the casualty reports in his rigging shed in England. He read the descriptions of men falling from the sky, harnesses released by the very modifications he had installed. The technical specifications he had followed precisely, the white webbing he had measured and cut, the release lugs he had sewn in place using rough rigger-style stitching. His work had killed 14 men. The investigation found no fault with Morrison or any other individual rigger. The modifications had been completed according to orders from Shaef. The technical specifications had been followed. The problem was systemic, inherent in the rushed implementation of a device that had been rejected for good reason 3 years earlier. The quick release box worked well when installed correctly with proper padding and positioning, but field modifications under time pressure with inconsistent materials and varying interpretations of specifications had introduced fatal variability. Morrison continued rigging parachutes through the winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945. He installed quick-release boxes on hundreds more harnesses, but the modifications became more standardized. Specific mounting height requirements were added to the technical specifications. All boxes received adequate padding. Quality control inspections verified correct assembly before harnesses were issued to paratroopers. The second-generation modifications, used by the 17th Airborne Division for Operation Varsity in March 1945, showed significantly lower failure rates. The last American combat jump of World War II was Varsity, the airborne assault across the Rhine River. Over 16,000 paratroopers from American and British airborne divisions jumped into Germany on the morning of March 24, 1945. The 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, veterans of Normandy and Market Garden, remained in reserve for this operation. Fresh units made the jump, including the 17th Airborne making its first combat jump using the improved second-generation quick-release modifications. The casualty rate from equipment failures during Varsity was notably lower than Market Garden, 2 confirmed cases of premature harness release, compared to 14 in the earlier operation. The improved standardization of the modifications, combined with better training on proper equipment use, had reduced but not eliminated the failure mode. The quick-release box remained a compromise, a device that solved one problem while creating another, accepted by military necessity rather than engineering perfection. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Quartermaster Corps conducted a comprehensive review of parachute equipment performance throughout the war. The final report, completed in August 1945, documented the complete history of the quick-release controversy, the 1941 testing and rejection, the Normandy drownings, the crash modification program before Market Garden, the premature releases, the improved second-generation modifications, the reduced but persistent failure rate through Varsity. The report's conclusions were measured but clear. The quick-release box had proven valuable in specific circumstances, particularly water landings or situations requiring immediate escape from the parachute harness. However, the device introduced reliability concerns that the original snap hook system did not exhibit. For future parachute development, the report recommended a fundamental redesign that would incorporate quick-release capability from the initial engineering phase, rather than as a field modification to existing equipment. This recommendation directly influenced the development of the T-7 parachute, which began reaching operational units in late 1944. The T-7 included an integrated quick-release box as standard equipment, designed into the harness from the beginning rather than retrofitted. The box was positioned lower on the chest to prevent interference with the reserve parachute. The internal mechanism required greater force to activate, reducing susceptibility to accidental release. A leather pad underneath the box provided superior cushioning compared to the horsehair felt used on the field modifications. But the T-7 arrived too late for most of World War II. The modified T-5 seconds equipped the majority of American airborne operations from Market Garden through Varsity. Thousands of paratroopers jumped with harnesses that had been hastily modified in rigging sheds across England, each modification slightly different depending on which rigger had assembled it, which materials had been available, which interpretation of the technical specifications had been applied. The human cost of this rushed implementation extended beyond the 14 confirmed deaths from premature release. An unknown number of injuries occurred when paratroopers, trained to strike the quick release button immediately upon landing, activated the mechanism too early while still being dragged by wind-filled canopies. The sudden release with the canopy still inflated caused men to be thrown to the ground or dragged across rough terrain without the harness distributing forces across their body. Broken bones, dislocations, and severe contusions were attributed to this pattern of use, though exact numbers were never compiled because these injuries were classified as landing casualties rather than equipment failures. Staff Sergeant Morrison was discharged from the Army in November 1945. He returned to civilian life in Ohio, where he had worked in a textile mill before the war. He never spoke publicly about his work as a parachute rigger. His family learned only fragments of his wartime service, that he had worked with parachutes, that he had been stationed in England, that his work had been considered important but not dangerous, behind the lines rather than in combat. He kept one item from his military service, a quick-release box, cadmium-plated steel with a round activation button, removed from a parachute harness, being retired after the war ended. The box sat on a shelf in his workshop for decades. When asked about it, he would say only that it was a piece of equipment he had worked with during the war. Nothing more. The 14 men who had fallen when their harnesses released prematurely were not discussed. The 37 who had drowned in Normandy were not mentioned. The broader significance of the quick-release story extends beyond parachute engineering into the nature of military innovation under combat pressure. The device had been properly tested in 1941 and correctly rejected based on that testing. The test dummy Oscar had provided clear evidence that the quick-release mechanism could fail catastrophically. Engineers and military planners had made the rational decision to adopt the more reliable snap-hook system. But war has a way of overriding rational engineering decisions with urgent operational necessity. The drownings in Normandy created political and moral pressure that superseded technical concerns. Soldiers were dying from equipment that worked as designed but failed to account for real combat conditions. Something had to be done. The quick-release box was available, even if imperfect. The modification could be implemented quickly, even if quality would be inconsistent. The choice became not between good and bad solutions, but between accepting continued drowning deaths or accepting a different category of falling deaths. This pattern repeated throughout World War II in countless smaller decisions about equipment, tactics, and training. The war moved faster than careful testing and evaluation could accommodate. Solutions were implemented based on immediate need rather than long-term validation. Field modifications became standard procedure, with riggers, mechanics, and armourers adapting equipment to solve problems that hadn't been anticipated during peacetime development. The quick-release modification was neither a complete success nor a total failure. It saved some lives. It cost others. For every paratrooper who escaped a water landing in seconds using the quick-release button, there was potentially another who experienced premature release during opening shock. The device existed in the uncomfortable middle ground of military equipment that works well enough to remain in service, but never works well enough to be fully trusted. By the time the Korean War began in 1950, the T-7 parachute with integrated quick-release capability had become standard for American airborne forces. The field-modified T-5 seconds were retired, their rough rigger-style stitching and inconsistent assembly relegated to military museums and private collections. The lessons learned from Market Garden and Varsity informed the engineering of subsequent parachute designs, including the T-10 that would serve American paratroopers from 1954 through 2014. But the fundamental tension remained. Parachute harnesses must be secure enough to hold a soldier during the violent forces of deployment and descent, yet must be quick enough to release immediately upon landing when that soldier needs to move, fight, or escape. These requirements exist in opposition. Every design is a compromise. The quick-release box was simply one point along that spectrum of compromise, adopted under crisis, implemented imperfectly, and replaced eventually by marginally better solutions that still couldn't fully resolve the underlying contradiction. The test dummy Oscar that fell from the sky in 1941 and the 14 paratroopers who fell during Market Garden in 1944 were casualties of the same problem. Equipment that seemed adequate in testing failed under the unpredictable conditions of actual use. The difference was that Oscar's fall prompted a rational decision to reject the quick-release design, while the combat deaths prompted a rational decision to improve and continue using it. Both decisions were correct given their contexts. Both decisions were insufficient given the complexity of the problem they were trying to solve. Staff Sergeant Morrison understood this in ways that were difficult to articulate. The parachutes he modified had saved lives and cost lives, sometimes the same parachute doing both depending on circumstances he couldn't have predicted or controlled. The rigger-style stitching he had applied to white webbing in a shed in England had performed exactly as specified, while failing in ways that specifications couldn't prevent. His work was both successful and inadequate, like nearly everything else about the vast, messy, improvised industrial effort that was World War II. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.